So now we have council officers, having heard all the evidence over the last 4 days, are going to present a brief verbal summary to us ahead of their written into a reply. Hand it over to you, James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, there's been quite extensive, I guess to start with, quite extensive submissions today and over the previous 3 days. In terms of a timeline for a more formal written right of reply, I suspect that 2 weeks won't cut it. Mr. Chair, I was going to invite Ms. Pearson to maybe suggest what might be doable. That's in lieu of any directions to work with any third parties or submitters on other work, for example. So is there any thinking around collaboration with other submitters at the stage before we commit to a timeline for a right of reply?
No, I don't think we haven't identified that unless you want to suggest. So
there has been some direction to liaison minor matters, such as with Mr. Badham in relation to the supermarkets.
He's offered to provide material by a certain time.
Exactly. I think because the panel have been quite clear in their timing requests for if you are going to clarify a particular matter, you need to hear. And I think in most cases you've given the submitters a week. Given we are going over the Christmas break, my initial thoughts were the end of January might be more realistic for responding.
I was looking as to when the next hearing starts, and that's the hearing 10, multi-purpose treaty settlement in Carrington State. That's scheduled to start on the 24th of March. So we've got a wee bit of run up to our next hearing. So without holding the opinions of my fellow commissioners, it seems to me that the end of January sounds reasonable. Does anyone have an objection to that? But it's it's 6 topics. There's a lot of evidence that is highly detailed, a lot of expert evidence. It's a crucially important component of the plan, not that it is unimportant components. But we would like to give them sufficient time to respond to the evidence.
Potentially, in that sense, even a week or two further than that might.
Well, let's work to the end of January. And if you feel like you're not able to achieve that, then we'll be happy to receive a memo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it looks like Mr. McElroy. He looks like he's had a bit of a run.
Lovely seafront property.
We might invite maybe Mr. McElroy to probably undertake his presentation now. So,
yeah, good afternoon, Mr. McElroy. Are we pronouncing your name right?
McElroy, it's close enough. I've had all sorts of variations on that one.
We do like to get those right. I take it you just want to provide some response to the economic evidence that was presented to us today by Ms. Campbell-Free, is that correct?
And just a high-level summary of my review of Mr. Foy's primary statement.
Yeah, okay. Up to you.
Thank you very much. So apologies if I'm out of breath. I just ran out of up 5 flights of stairs, so that was fun. So it'll take me a couple of minutes just to get my breath back. So I think just to lead off with, I've obviously reviewed Mr. Foy's primary statement of evidence. I've received his supplementary this morning. So, and of course I sat in this during his session a bit earlier. So I'll comment on some of those. I think at a high level, at a principle level, we actually agree on a lot of things in terms of the assessment. And it appears to me as if the key things that we're actually agreeing on is the need to avoid fragmentation of the land resource. And we also agree on what are the key elements that are important when we look at horticulture and horticulture production. So that's really soils, water, and the parcel sizes. We also agree that horticulture is really important, but I think in terms of where we go with that information, we end up in slightly different positions. In my view, horticulture in the proposed zone is actually significant in the district context. So in terms of approach or methodology, Mr. Foy uses the small scale of horticulture in the proposed zone, so that's in terms of employment and GDP to support the case that the horticulture zone is not needed. He also looks at the mix of activities based on the relative composition in terms of lot sizes in the proposed area, and saying, look, there's a lot of change in there. It's really embedded into the system. So we don't need the proposed zone. So in my view, when we look at the economic effect of something, we actually need to have a slightly more nuanced approach, just have a high level employment relative to total size of the parcels. I think that's likely to actually miss some of the important aspects and attributes. So in terms of the data points, we agree that we actually need to look at more than just employment. We also need to look at GDP. So as part of the assessment, I actually went back, because Mr. Foy quotes the Infometrics GDP numbers. I went back to that source, I had a look at it. So essentially what that shows is if we look at it over the long sort of time frame, past 20 years, horticulture is actually growing, in terms of GDP. And that's important because that's a key generator of new money for the district. We also see that horticulture as a share of agriculture is actually increasing. So what that means is that horticulture is actually outperforming. It's growing faster than other parts of agriculture. Now, as part of Mr. Foy's assessment says, look, horticulture is less than 2% of the total GDP, therefore it's quite small. We can discard that. But the question here is, what is the benchmark that we need to use, and how does that 2%, how does it compare with other regions? So if we look at the Kaipara, horticulture is about 2.1% of the total GDP. In the far in Northland, it's about 1%, and in the far north, it's around, on average, around about 2%. So we actually see that the size of that economy or that sector relative to the size of the economy is pretty much on par with some of the other areas around it. But I think it's also important to think, when we look at GDP, what does it actually capture? What is included in it? So GDP is a measure of the value of production, how different parts are actually combined. And Mr. Foy in his supplementary says, well, he asks a question, well, what portion of GDP actually sticks? How much of that actually stays in the district? And I think that's a valid point. So if we look at what are the component parts of GDP, about half of that, it tends to be around about employment, and a large portion of it's also operating surplus. And a portion of operating surplus is paid out normally as dividends, and that's the stuff that flows out of the region to the owners, as he suggests. But if we look at those relative shares, salaries and wages, operating surplus, as a share of GDP, we're looking at almost 80%. So the portion of GDP that we're actually talking about, notwithstanding that some of it could leak out of the region, is actually quite big. So it's an important metric, and the fact that it's actually large and increasing actually shows the significance of this sector of the local economy. So another element that we need to consider is also the overall economic linkages. So that is looking past just GDP, because GDP actually already reflects goods that are bought from and sold to. But we need to get a bit of a handle on the goods that are produced. Where does it actually go to? And that's important because if you think about the goods that are sold, some of that, of course, leaves the district, but it means that money actually comes back in. So that's the revenue that's generated. So large portions of the produce that's produced actually flows out of the region and satisfied needs in Auckland and internationally. So that's really important because that's the money that then comes in. And that's important. If you think about far north, what it is, it's generally lagging, in terms of the socio-demographic metrics and indicators. It tends to grow slower. So the productive parts of the economy, of which agriculture, manufacturing really sits center in the far north context, those are the sectors bringing and generating money. They are really important in that context. So we need to protect the potential to actually look after that and retain those productive activities. In terms of the comment from Mr. Foy, in terms of GDP's gone up, employment hasn't. So again, it kind of brings it back to the potential leakage. We also need to remember that if we express GDP change relative to them on a per employee basis, that's productivity. And GDP going up faster than employment means that productivity is actually increasing. Now, what that also means is some of that productivity gains actually flows through in higher wages. So it's not just a case that higher GDP means that all the money actually flows out. A lot of that actually sticks in the local economy. And a final point in terms of the economic linkages is the value of the horticulture sector is actually acknowledged and actively planned for. In the wider sense, if we think about what's happening around Kaikoai and the Ngāwhai Industrial Estate, with the efforts to establish Food North. So that's an initiative that draws on the backward linkages. So that's the goods coming from horticulture, keep it in the region, add value to that, lift the production before it actually then flows out of the region. So it's retaining those flow-on effects and the multipliers, keeping it locally, keeping it in the local district to make sure that we actually capture those gains. So the overall context within which we look at horticulture is really important. It's not just a small part, it's embedded in the local economy, and it actually has strong links to other parts of the economy as well. In terms of employment, so that's a metric that Mr. Foy uses most of it for most of the analysis. I think we agree that employment in horticulture is actually under pressure. It is trending down. But if we step back and see and have a look at what actually happened with horticulture over the past sort of 20 odd years, we actually see and how much of the growth or the relative change occurred within the proposed hort area. We actually see that the share of the district's employment, horticulture employment that's within the proposed area is actually quite large. Currently it sits around a third, but if we go back a few years, look at the average of the past 4 or 5 years, that peaks around 38%. So that's almost 40% of the district's horticulture employment in the local area. So that's a significant share. That share is also trending up, if we look over the past sort of 20 odd years. So in terms of the significance as a production area and in terms of reflecting where employment is for that sector, again, that points to the importance of the proposed area. So in terms of, I'll just skip through some of this, in terms of recent trends where we look at the subdivisions, again, we see there, a lot of pressure on this area looking over the past sort of 20 years. We use slightly different approaches and slightly different data sets, but I think the key thing here is, from my perspective, if I look at the change, it's persistent, it's ongoing, and it's difficult to see that pressure on that land resource in terms of demand for subdivision actually just going away. And of course, that has implications for fragmentation and the shifting land use. Now, it's important to note that this pressure that we're seeing in the proposed area is much greater than the subdivision demand that we're seeing elsewhere in the rural production zone. So this is really sort of a location thing. It's around Kerikeri, and it really goes to that lifestyle thing. And I think part of the assessment is when we look at the proposed or looking at the different parcels, we need to look past the count of parcels in the different size bands, and we need to look at the how much of the land is actually still available. So if we look just at the count of parcels as a share, I think that's slightly misleading and is likely to mask how much of the land resource is actually still available in those big, large lots. So if we look at, using that 8 hectare thresholds, approximately, well, close to half, 47% of the land area is still in those large lots. But if we, look at on a per parcel basis, and we look at the less than 8 hectares, that's 93%. So it's clearly important that we just make sure we really understand what the different components actually show. And then the final sort of element is we look at the water and obviously the spatial extent of the irrigation schemes. But I think the key takeaway from my perspective here is that water is an important resource, and it's not necessarily the irrigation scheme is not the sole source of it. There are other options. Other options could be developed in future. There's the aquifer and growth potential in that sort of space. So in summary, I think Mr. Foy and myself, we actually agree on some of the broad brush principles. That's really the need to avoid fragmentation of the viable land. We agree on the key attributes. However, in my view, horticulture is significant in the district. It's also a significant resource in the proposed zone. It's really part of the productive landscape. It adds to the local economy. It's got solid linkages. It generates income for the district. So that's money coming from the outside in. And I support the proposed horticulture zone. So that's in a high level summary of my statement. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I assume you can provide, that's in writing, you can provide that to us.
Yep.
Online now, is it? Okay, very good. Thank you. Any questions then?
No, I guess it's just the significance, whether that's sufficient to meet the, well, I guess it would be in terms of what you put to us, the criteria to look at a rezoning to provide specifically for a horticultural zone. But I think you've answered that pretty clearly in what you've said, so it's a matter of evaluation, and I guess. And thanks for that.
Yeah, just on that topic, the significance, you kind of mentioned, I think, district-wide. You know, this is significant district-wide, and then your statement, your earlier statement, 29th of November, it says it's only a third of the district's horticulture employment in this horticulture zone. So does that water down the significance?
Well, that's in 1 year. And so if we look at and that's 2023. So we also need to say, well, what's actually happened in 2023? We had a whole bunch of storms, slowing economy. But if we take a slightly longer view, so not just the most recent, that share of total employment actually goes up to, approaching 40%.
Right.
And the other thing here is if we look at those 5-year averages and we go back 20 years, and again, looking at a 5-year average and need to look through some of the peaks and troughs, that was around 29%. So we actually see that as a share of total, it's actually increasing.
Okay, thank you. And my other question is, you do acknowledge in your statement that refined mapping might be necessary. And I don't know if you were there when Ms. McGrath was giving her talk on her maps. Were you there for that?
Yeah, look, I think it's obviously needing to take a good look at it. Obviously I haven't done that analysis yet, but I think there's certainly the opportunity to look at the spatial extent, but that then again has to consider a whole range of other factors, reverse sensitivity, and how to manage all those sort of interactions.
Yeah, I guess my question on that would be, you've just talked about the last 20 years, how this land has become more and more fragmented. I think a map that would be quite interesting to have a look at is, or a series of maps, is lot sizes, which Mr. McGrath had a map showing, relative sizes, different colours. What that would be like over the last 20 years, maybe at 5-year increments kind of thing, and see how what the pace of that change has been.
Yeah. So I've had a look at the titles and the date of the formations. I don't have the information about the spatial extent of those individual parcels as at 2000. I don't know if those boundaries are available. But I did look at the tidal formation, and it's actually steady as she goes. It's a constant rate, and it's really persistent. And the rate of change in the proposed area is actually faster than what we're seeing elsewhere.
And do you have a crystal ball? Can you think that that's going to keep going?
Well, I guess if I have to take a stab at it, it's like what needs to change in order for the underlying patterns to change. What are the drivers of growth? It's really the choice for lifestyle. And, based on what we're seeing at the moment and sort of historic trends, it's difficult to see a big divergence away from those pressures unless we change something.
Right. So you think it might continue? That's your kind of...
Yeah, unless we change, make it more difficult, yes.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Lawrence. I'll just refer to some of the things that Mr. Ford, I asked him questions. He said a third of the economic value was in the Hawke zone and 2/3 outside. And he indicated that was in the Far North District.
Yeah, I think he was referring to employment, not value, but yes.
Okay, and then you've said wages or employment is 38% of that employment of Hawke workers is in the Hawke zone.
Say that again, you were just breaking up.
When we talk wages or employment, you said 38% of the Hawke workers are in the Hawke zone?
On average, so that was the average over the past 5 years. Because what we see is employment in the horticulture sector is actually quite cyclical, so it moves with the business cycle, so there's overs and unders.
Yeah, and you use that as a measure of the value of the GDP, but GDP value of production, and you use that 8%.
So the challenge we have with GDP is it's not reported at a fine spatial scale. So GDP is only reported at the smallest spatial resolution for that is the district, the TA levels. So what we then do is saying, look, that's the GDP trend at the district, and then we use employment because we've got a finer handle on the spatial distribution of where employees are across the district, and we use that as a metric, as a proxy to say the location of where different activities occurs.
Okay, you also referred to, I guess, economic activity. That was just referred to 2023. You referred to storms, we had road closures, both Glendale and the Mangkokka. That all has an impact.
Yep, that's right. So, and again, so as part of my analysis, I actually went back and had a look at the 20 years to see what happened with GDP trends, because you do have a lot of sort of short-term shocks, you know, floods, roads outs, those sort of things that if you only look at 1 year, you run the risk of actually, there could be things that mask the actual true value. So if you think about what's happened with storms locally, loss of major roading accessibility, sure, you're going to see some sectors actually fall away. So looking at just 1 year, you're going to miss or there's a risk that you miss important trends.
You know, that road close to that had a massive impact on forestry.
Yes.
Both coming from south to Monterey Port and from this area here. The other point you pointed out was, if you look at the parcel size, it's greater than 8 hectares. On an area basis, it still occupies 47% of the water zone.
Yes.
And yet what was referred to in Mr. Ford's evidence was 94% of parcels are less than 10 hectares.
That's right.
So on that basis, they're only making up just around about 50%.
Well, that's the thing. And so I guess the point is we need to be careful to understand what the different metrics actually show. So my understanding is Mr. Foy uses the parcels to show that there's quite a diversity and a mix of use. And I'd use the land area to say, look, actually, there's quite a lot of potential to actually undertake the horticultural activity.
Yeah, because one of the questions I asked him was also, if you look at the land area, because he made a statement that horticultural use is not, or horticultural production, if you like, is not the dominant use in the horticultural zone based on land area.
Yeah, so I heard that. Now I have, so looking at the process and understanding exactly how the coding mechanism works to actually say, well, this is a parcel of land, this is the activity on that parcel of land, is actually quite difficult, because you can have a parcel with a residential activity as well as horticultural activity on it. But what is the, how's that parcel actually recorded in that space? So I'm always a bit cautious when I use those sort of land use classifications, whether it's from council rates or whether it's from LINs and those sort of things. And I guess from my perspective, I've actually gone back and had a look at the employment distribution. And if we say, looking at what's actually happening in the hort zone, the proposed area, agriculture, and I haven't looked specifically at horticulture, but I can. Agriculture is the largest one. If you then go down a step and saying how much of the activity is actually still related to agriculture, so that where it's a warehouse or some sort of a transportation activity, actually buying from or selling to the agriculture sector, you actually end up with quite high proportions in that space.
Okay, and 2 more questions. I'll stick on what we're talking about. Ms. McGrath, you mentioned that the economic viability was no better than other parts of the district by having the hort zone, and I challenge her on that because of transport in particular. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, the transport thing is an interesting one, because it really depends on your product and your commodity. If it's a sort of a grade 2 product, then you're not that worried about spoilage and damage during the transit. But if, of course, you're looking at primary goods that you really want to export, then the appearance of the goods really important. So you want to reduce your transport function as part of the total. In terms of the costs, it's not as if we're transporting sand. That's a low value, high volume commodity. The goods are actually, does have some volume. So it is less sensitive to transport, but I'm not saying it's not insensitive to transport at all. But it also depends on the specific locations, because you do have hubs that you want to aggregate some of your goods from, so that you make sure that you can generate those economies of scale for the next leg of your transport function.
Yeah, my point was probably relating to our food, particularly our gold queue food, the high value stuff, short distance to the processing, packing, coastal, and then they don't really want to go to town. Last question, you mentioned GDP is growing and it brings new money to the district. What is new money?
So if I find that true, I'll let you know. So this is not selling goods and services to ourselves. That is selling it to other people out beyond our region. So we're making something that's of value to people outside our borders, beyond our borders, and that capital then flows in as part of sales.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGrath. I think the I haven't got any further questions for you. Thanks again. You're welcome to stay online and listen to the rest of the presentation.
So,
Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I'm thinking is that maybe we let Ms. Pearson go, and maybe we circle back to perhaps where we might seek to provide some maybe additional legal support and maybe agree some of the grounds for that. So if we,
That was going to be one of my questions. The fact that you're foreshadowing that you're wanting it sort of really answers my question in many respects.
Mr. Chair. I'm not, we've obviously heard a lot of evidence this week and a volume of information. So I'm not going to use this opportunity to go through point by point and submitter by submitter. I'm really just going to pick up on some key themes that might help sort of round out this week. When I do get to my written right of reply, my focus is going to be on those provisions of the rural production zone and the horticulture zone. They are the two zones that were clearly most in contention this week.
You didn't hear any evidence about the other zones.
It is, but in terms of the spatial extent of them in the district, it is the predominant zones in the district. So it's understandable, but that's where the proportion of evidence has fallen. Some of the issues we've heard this week will be addressed in other hearing streams. So we've definitely got crossover with subdivision, with definitions and zoning. But I will be liaising with reporting officers on those chapters to bring through those themes to make sure they're addressed in those reports. And in some cases, when it comes to the zoning, it'll be myself. So you will get some continuity there. With me seeing some of these questions about spatial extents, we're not handing over to somebody else in that sense. It's me carrying it through. And I think James has foreshadowed the questions about the mechanism of how we deal with the horticultural zone in terms of, is it a zone, is it a precinct? We are going to look at that closer. That was clearly something that had some good discussion on today, but I think where I'm still landing is that from what I've heard today, I haven't changed my position that some sort of intervention using a spatial mechanism somewhere in the PDP is required to protect what has been demonstrated as a significant and under pressure horticultural industry around Kirikiri and Waipapa.
So those are really good words, so I'm going to write them down. Some sort of intervention using a spatial mechanism to
protect the significant and under pressure horticultural industry around Kirikiri and Waipapa. There was a balanced mix of views about things like its significance and the pressure that was on it. We've heard a variety of positions. We've had the regional council, through individual landowners and community groups, and a lot of them do see value in taking a different approach that prioritises horticulture. And I think the critical thing to me was the management of reverse sensitivity effects, where the critical difference was in terms of what you'd want to do differently between that and maybe the balance of the rural production zone. Obviously, still have to manage reverse sensitivity in the rural production zone. The balance of the area outside of Kirikiri and Waipapa is not facing the same development pressure that this specific spatial location is. And that, for me, is the turning point as to why you look at Kirikiri Waipapa differently to the balance of horticultural areas elsewhere. There's also, in my view, there's a timing question. You've obviously heard evidence before you about, well, if you're going to do it big. Go look everywhere, look over the whole district and find all of the horticultural locations and do it that way. The reason why, as I understand it, that wasn't done prior to notifications, two reasons. The first was that the feedback from the industry was that this is the only area that needs this intervention now. And that maybe in the future, if there are other areas where there's other development pressures, maybe the nexus of factors, which was outlined by Ms. McGrath as sort of being the industry, the infrastructure and the water, I would add growth pressure to that as the combination. And that's the missing factor that we don't find spatially across the rest of the district. So there may be more work on that in the future, but I agree it's not something that we can look at through this from scope reasons and process reasons. Can't take that view further and look at the district as a whole and say where else might this zone go. You've obviously got, I've got a variety of drafting options in front of me for various ways that we could look at the objectives and policies, and I definitely saw elements that came through that I thought had merit, and I will be looking at those in much more detail through the right of reply. But at a really high level, I appreciate that Ms. McGrath's example that was put to you was clearly done in the 2-week window, and it was as her initial thoughts as opposed to something that's polished, and completely appreciate that. But I do think a lot of the mechanisms of just adding in more HPL protection into the rural production zone, I don't see that as the magic bullet that somehow gets you the same outcome and the same effect as what is proposed in the horticultural zone, particularly with the uncertainties we have about where the FPS HPL land. Those uncertainties in my mind almost strengthen the need to look at how much of land around the horticultural industry needs to be picked up in order to manage particularly reverse sensitive effects. I do accept where some of the submitters were going with respect to subdivision, that the rural production zone, horticultural zone, as per my 42A recommendments, they end up with the same discretionary activity, minimum lot size of 8 hectares. So from just a simply subdivision angle, they do actually function the same. So really the difference I see between the two is stronger objective and policy direction in the horticultural zone and the targeted policy direction in the horticultural zone, combined with the land use rules and the more stringent activity status for a lot of those rules. That's really where I see a lot of those differences falling. And a lot of the evidence I heard this week was actually providing quite helpful suggestions for maybe where those distinctions could actually increase rather than become more homogenous. And you also heard from some of the sectors that we need a nuanced approach. It's felt like a buzzword of the hearing, where, you know, the far north is not one fits all. We need different regimes. And I think to take a step back to, while the RPROS does the job for everybody, actually moves us further away from that and tries to use that one size fits all approach, which I heard from a lot of other submitters that week that that's not actually the way they want to go. They want more of a distinction in how we manage different parts of the rural environment. Just see if there's anything else I wanted to bring up. Maybe a comment on LUC 4, because that was one of the other issues, and I guess that's an issue that crosses over both the horticultural zone and the rural production zone. Again, probably bringing you back to the beginning about why the proposed district plan as notified didn't mention LUC 4, because it didn't need to, because the highly productive land definitions notified already inherently included it. So I appreciate it feels like an elevation of a level.
You know where LUC 4 would have fitted in to the, I think you were using versatile soils at that time, was the terminology?
No, it wasn't. The versatile soils definition as notified is exactly the same as the one in the regional policy statement, and it doesn't include LUC 4.
No, but would you, if the HPL hadn't, just that never happened, and you're still going with that definition, would you have included LUC 4 in that definition of versatile soils?
It was already notified in the definition of highly productive land. So that was really what I guess. That's why we put it in, because when I went back and looked through the objectives and policies of both the horticulture zone and rural production zone, I realised that every time I read the term highly productive land, I then had to think that means something different now. When this was notified, it included LUC 4. Now, if I'm aligning it with the NTS HPL definition, it can't include LUC 4 anymore. So if I still want to think about LUC 4, I have to mention it specifically. So that's sort of the origins of where it's come from. I do see some issues as raised by submitters of what happens if you might end up with a sort of hangover legacy of mentioning LUC 4 if other things drop out underneath. So that is something I'll have to look at, particularly for the rural production zone, where the alignment was intended to get close to the NPSHPL and be future-proof to move wherever that moves in terms of the land that's there. So I completely appreciate that we might end up with an unintentional gap if Luck 3 drops away. So my right of reply will be covering how I think we can remedy that. I may recommend a different approach for the horticulture zone in that respect. And we may move that away from mentioning specific definitions or like statuses and focus actually on what's the zone trying to do, irrespective necessarily of just the soil under the ground, because as we've heard this week, that is just one factor. So there may be a reframing of the policy direction there to be clearer on that. I think really I might leave it there in terms of where I'm going with that. There are obviously, I've spoken a lot about the horticulture zone and those submitters. There are issues raised by other submitters where I think there's some further work to be done and some arguments that I think have got merit in exploring further. I won't go through those now. I've kind of got a running list in my head of things that I think we can work on, but that's the focus of the right of reply. So happy to take any questions on that. Is anything?
It's
useful or useful statement.
something.
Yeah, I have just check their list of these.
Sure.
Nothing to do with the high level. Hopefully it's given us, but first one is come on to the hearing. They've tabled evidence, in particular, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, who are seeking further changes. Will you add though? Make sure that you respond. I think that's the only one that's even about me. Or other than Mr. McPhee for heavy industry zone interface, production zone, so you cover that off.
We'll cover that off. We're having some internal discussions, but we've been on that already.
Then I think there's some questions on the other zones that have already been talked about, and they're kind of matters of detail. And I think I'd like to just check those off with you if you don't mind.
Well, this is the time to sort it out.
Yeah.
There's only three.
I need to take notes.
Okay, horticultural processing facilities zone. Paragraph 73 of the report. You're recommending an increase to the impermeable surface permitted threshold from 30% to 50%. And you call that a modest increase. It's quite a big jump, 30 to 50. Well, I don't call that modest, but I don't know. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, either now or in your reply.
Potentially modest was the incorrect word to describe the increase, but that really came from, and I think it's been brought up as a theme a lot this week, that when it comes to supporting the whole horticultural industry, the provisions have to be fit for purpose for the operational needs of that industry. We've heard that in terms of artificial crop protection structures and saying that sometimes there's just limitations on what we need to be able to do. And so that was really looking at it in response to the request from Horticulture New Zealand to say, look, understand what you're trying to do, but 30% is actually going to be too hard for us to do, and 50% strikes a better balance between because in the horticultural processing zone, in my mind, elements like built dominance are not really factors that you'd be looking at. And I think the coverage was really probably a combination of stormwater factors as some of it. So because you didn't sort of have that amenity, built dominance, privacy, shading aspect in the horticultural processing facility zone, I thought that is one area we could probably move to better assist the horticulture industry in the area.
I don't think there's anyone challenging that number anyway, other than Mr. Fish, who was talking about the matters of discretion, perhaps strengthening those over the right ones.
But that's a request he's asked, cutting across all the rural zones.
Yes, that might. Perhaps. Okay, that was that one. Thank you. And the other one was the settlement zone. Paragraphs 125 to 127 of your report to do with the height in relation to the boundary standard. to clarify, is there an exception to that standard just for the northern boundary of those properties, for those sites of the zone? Is that how that works?
In terms of the change between 2 metres and 55 versus 2 metres and 45 on eastern western and 2 metres and 35, that's a consistent drafting approach for all of the rural zones. It's not special for the settlement zone. If it's helpful, the operative equivalent was a flat 2 metres and 45 on all boundaries.
That's cool. There's nothing actually I need to write on further response. And then paragraph 131, that fences.
Is this still for settlement? Sorry.
Still same line.
Sorry, what was the paragraph number?
131. This is 1.8 metre high fences. This is in the context of it being a rural settlement zone, but I guess are they kind of urban anyway? And the only reason they're in the rural is because of they're not serviced. Okay, sort of answer my question.
I think that one was an odd one when I went and looked at the standard and trying to dig back into the origins of it, speaking with some of the other reporting officers. It appeared that it had come from the mixed use zone in origin, and it was more about, it was trying to manage a whole lot of different activities that might occur in the mixed use zone and how you might use 1.8 metre high fences and screening to kind of manage the interface between activities, but completely took the point of the submitters that said, look, in the rural settlement zone, 1.8 metre high fences required, particularly on road boundary everywhere. You're actually cutting into our ability to see our neighbours and talk to people, and it's actually, you will create these sort of high barriers that are not really in keeping with the character that you want of a small rural settlement. So I think it was potentially a drafting issue of taking a standard that was drafted for something else in a different zone and inappropriately applying it. So I've looked at it and said, I think the only scenario where that might be useful is on the boundary with the rural production zone, because that may be an area to manage those interface issues that having some kind of visual out of sight, out of mind fence might actually help with that reverse sensitivity issue, but not internally within the zone.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of, to remind me why I raised that issue is because it's that interface with the rural production zone. I don't typically see 1.8 metre high timber fences in the rural zone as maintaining and enhancing rural character and amenity values, for example. But I guess if it's against a settlement zone boundary where you've got houses and what have you, it really doesn't matter. But you're looking at it from the other way. If you're in the settlement zone and you're interfaced with the rural production zone, it's permitted to go 1.8 metre high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a go both ways. I think it benefits the rural production zone. There is, I've been in a lot of hearings and consenting situations where reverse sensitivity and what do you do to kind of manage that's discussed. And one of the things that continuously comes up is that sometimes if you can see something, the perception that you don't like it or there's something wrong with it increases. So it's trying to find some kind of visual barrier to the big giant packing shed or the the barn or the operations. If you don't see it and you put up the fence, maybe you put up some plants and you do something, it does help people to not fixate on the production activities that are happening on the adjacent site.
They can look out across the.
If that's
Sure.
Yeah.
That's fine. Let's clarify. You don't need to provide anything further.
okay.
Small things. I mean, and I think James, you're probably going to cover these at the end of that now. Obviously, are we going to be seeking legal advice as to whether the special zone is not?
If it's even a mechanism that's legally available to us.
Yes. Yeah, right. So if you were, we'd probably do it this minute, but I'd rather have it come from you, that request. So that's great.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to frame it in a broad sense too, as to the meaning and effect of the national standard as a whole. For example, whether Section 32AA is available to you to make, what scope do you have available to you to make decisions I've heard mixed things. So I think some general clarification might help the process.
That's right, because that you know, and the other thing is if it's not, there's a precinct available. And does section 32AA let you go there? Even, yeah. I mean, it might be that you don't think that's a viable option. I was just exploring whether there was another way to achieve that outcome that was more. So look, we'll be really interested in hearing that. Just two other things that really sort of propped up that came out of some of my questions, and that was, do we really need to have an impervious surface control given the lot sizes, given the land? It's an urban standard. We really, I mean, no one's really going to see 15% of a hectare farm in impervious surfaces. So that's another, that's just a quick, I can see how it applies to the other zones, right? Particularly as your lot sizes get smaller and those properties look a little bit more urban, then surely impervious surfaces are relevant. Just think, just in terms of the raw production and even the horticulture zone and whatever all it ends up in. Whether that is necessary. Having said that, I don't even know if there's relief to do that. But if there is, interested in your response on that. And the same applies to the population boundary control. I mean, there's a big part of me that sort of says it's a rural production zone, it's a horticulture production zone. Shade cloths are an inherent function of the zone. You recognise that in your rural framework, choose to live there. There's all those good questions from Commissioner McNally, which is you're going to be, you're going to be particularly highly productive land. Why are you sacrificing it to the potential effects of shading? And if you think, and if the answer is, well, we need something, then I think you might have said, should we just apply a standard? You have to really do the 55, 45, 35. Could a standard approach be 2 metres 45? What about 3 metres 45? And if you want to provide some sort of amenity, so maybe then one recognises the ability to maximise.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, look, I note that for HPL, there's direction explicitly says prioritise, and that's very strong and clear direction in my view of those activities. I guess I note that not all zone is HPL. However, I would agree that the same principle applies. So we will explore that.
Yeah, we're giving you the license to go there if we can. Sure, we can find solutions.
It was on the list of.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's really excellent there.
Over the side boundaries, but particularly road.
Yeah, the road. I think road might be
right on the bin.
Should be a road particularly. Having said that, I understand side boundaries. So really, it leaves us to thank you for a really good effort to prepare a huge number, 6 topics, massive amounts of submissions, wide range of issues, a lot of extensive and probing evidence, questions from us. It's been a very successful hearing, we think, much better informed than we were on Monday. And so credit to the council team for the sort of effort. I know you've got a lot of work to do. And wish you luck and have a good Christmas in this rain and take some time off.
And I'll save all my questions.
Mr. Chair, there's probably just a few things to tidy up after that as well. I know obviously Cavalli appeared. We'll look to engage as soon as we can. I think that process.
Let's say something about that. I'm still hoping that maybe there might be something beyond the scope of this panel that may be able to help them out in some regards. I don't know how much issues are yet to be resolved, or whether it's clear cut as they're presenting. I accept that.
Yeah, look, we'll endeavour to make the best of the situation as we are able. But I certainly would suggest to the panel that those range of those matters that have been to minute 14 would still apply to resolving the issues that Kawali maybe still have, and but that would be helpful for them or to us to help them. So
what might be helpful is what they could do, what they could actually reasonably do now under the operatively proposed provisions that could be passed back to them, that might actually get them to be able to do something.
look, I think without standing on Mr. Wyeth's toes, obviously Mr. Wyeth was present, and you'll recall the coastal environment, I'll call it a carve out of the urban zones, and if for example the settlement zone was the appropriate zone for other particular reasons, Mr. Wyeth was sort of the view that actually the urban environment would be similar and therefore could be a rule, for example, that would apply to that particular settlement zone or even potentially others. But there are pathways, there are clear pathways already within the plan that allow them to get consent for whatever it appears the market has been resistant to moving forward through those pathways. So we'll work through that as best we can. The other matter, there's a couple of other matters as well. Obviously, we'll get some information from Port NZ, just talked about around those shelters, trade structures, official structures. And one thing, I guess, we will have a soils expert, and I think I'm not hearing the need at this stage to get any immediate engagement. I think Ms. Pearson and I discussed generally, and I think we indicated through the hearing as well that maybe once we get to other approaches that will, if we are looking at spatial extent, it may be useful to bring some of those experts together, noting that soils are not necessarily the determining factor for those, but just highlighting that might be an option for us. Yeah. Again, noting it's not the determining or final factor, it's a range of factors that put the spatial extent of that together, but that's something that we will be prepared for at that time, and you may wish to also direct at some point as well. So I think that's probably all from us at this stage. I don't think there's anything further, Mr. Chair.
Let you know that we are still going to go to the Tauri Bay. We're going to have some lunch now, and we're also going to swing by the production rules of horticulture. Yes, and Mr. McNally's offered to give us a
Steve's tours.
Steve's tours.
Yeah. Look, Mr. Chair, it might also, given that the questions you've asked today, swing past the Seeker pack house as well, which I understand is a horticultural.
Yeah.
It's a horticulture processing zone.
It is not one of any other one from your significant. Yeah, sorry, big familiar.
We've got to the road.
Yeah, and Kitty Road is fine.
Right. We think we can probably squeeze both into today. I mean, we are staying the night, so let's take the rest of the day to do that. I assume you're travelling home this afternoon.
Yes.
So you're going to have lunch here first.
Yes, almost certainly, sir. Yes.
Yes, I'll encourage you to do that. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
How's the here? Turuki whakataha, turuki whakataha, haere te wānanga, kia wātia, aira, kua wātia, tuie tākie. And I will stop the recording.